Welcome everybody. We may be welcoming one or two people who drop in, but otherwise it's going to be quite an intimate discussion, which is good that we can focus on each other's work. I'm Julian Kwan from the Natural Resource Institute at the University of Greenwich, and I'll be your chair moderator for today. Two of the conveners of the group, Guizhou and Carolyn, are both presenting, so I've taken the chair. It's the second of two research paper panel sessions organized by the Development Studies Association study group on land politics, land politics and sustainability. And of course, we've benefited very closely during the year and now in conference from close links with the LSE UCL webinar group. So we had a good session yesterday, which this is the second session on the same overall theme, by the way, Unsettling Land Institutions and Actors, which is essentially seeking new ideas for research, policy and practice in this very challenging and changing global context that we're now in. So yesterday, the papers focused on questions of processes and outcomes of land registration, formalization, redistribution, changes in land administration. Today, we have four interesting papers which are focused on questions of land acquisition, development, or land-based investment, whether that's agriculture, infrastructure, or mining. I think we have examples of all of those, the impacts they've had, but particularly the institutions and processes that have mediated these developments and the implications for governance. So we have four papers. Firstly, and I'll read them briefly in running order, from Carolyn Diesely, PhD candidate at LSE, Change and Constancy in Customary Land Tenure in Sierra Leone, Implications for Global Governance Norms. Secondly, we'll hear from Faria Hashmat from the Lahore School of Economics in Pakistan, also a PhD, or I think your designation is MPhil candidate. The unsettling debate of land acquisition, the Land Acquisition Act 1894 and displacement caused by infrastructure development project in Pakistan. Thirdly, we'll hear from Guizhou Yang, who's another PhD candidate from LSE, property institutions and their explanatory power about Chinese agricultural investments in Zambia. And finally, we'll hear from Isaac Haruna Ziaba, who's also a PhD candidate at LSE on chieftaincy institutions, mineralized land mediation in Ghana. So we're looking forward to hearing what you all have to say. Everyone will have approximately 15 minutes to present. I'll tell you when you've had 10 minutes, or if I feel you may need to hurry up, I might suggest that. And then we shall have, after we've heard from everyone, we'll have approximately 30 or 35 minutes for discussion, essentially discussion amongst ourselves. So there we are. Carolyn, I think you're all set to be our first speaker. So please, you have the floor. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Julian. Let me just share my screen here. All right, is this, can everybody see this in full screen, yeah?
Good.
Okay, great. I tested it out a couple of times, but I don't know why this is sometimes playing up. Okay, yeah, so thank you, Julian, and I will present a part of my PhD fieldwork here on Sierra Leone. And I do apologize to some members of the very small audience who have already heard some of this presentation earlier this year, so it has changed a bit, but yeah, so this is probably familiar to some of you already. Okay, so yeah, to just give a little bit of the context here, I'm looking at Sierra Leone, and so after the civil war has ended in Sierra Leone in 2002, there has been a rise of large-scale land investments in the country. And that has come sort of hand in hand with discussions around land grabbing and reports of land rights and human rights violations. This is not exclusive to Sierra Leone, but that has been sort of a development generally in the last 10, 20 years. And the main way to respond to these debates about land grabbing has been, at least on the global governance agenda and from the international community, to come up with international guidelines and sort of best practice standards and codes of conduct to regulate investments, to make them more responsible or more sustainable, to achieve these like win-win situations. That's just the background. And in Sierra Leone, it seems that there has been a particular sort of emphasis on testing out these guidelines in the last 10, 20 years. And I don't want to go into detail about all the examples of how this has happened. Just maybe to mention one thing that I find very interesting is that the government of Sierra Leone has actually institutionalized some of the codes of conduct, especially the FAO voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of the tenure of land, fisheries, and forests, the VGGTs. So these have been institutionalized in the national land policy and make specific reference to them in the policy in about 90 paragraphs. So worldwide, there's a quote here from the FAO: worldwide, no other known policy refers as closely to the principles of the guidelines as Sierra Leone's new national land policy. And there were also some other initiatives in the last 10 years or so that specifically have funded or tested out actual investment projects as sort of exemplary use of guidelines. So in that context, I found, when I looked at a range of investments in the country, I found a puzzle that in spite of the enormous influence of international codes of conduct and the promotion of these by domestic and global actors, it seems that there is a lot of variation in the conformity to and the effectiveness of these guidelines. So I had a lot of cases of investment projects that I looked at that seemed to be sort of showcases of the use of guidelines and how to make an investment particularly responsible. And they were in the limelight of the sort of international community. And other cases didn't feature any specific reference to them, and they were still sort of under the umbrella of a land grabbing debate. And just to briefly mention, so this project is based on 6 months of field work in 2019. And I looked at about 9 cases of large-scale land investments. And sorry, is there's some background noise? I don't know if it's coming from somewhere. Okay, never mind. Yeah, so my data is based on a desk study and literature review, as well as over 150 interviews, structured and unstructured, semi-structured, unstructured, structured with stakeholders around these land investments, including central and sort of local government representatives, investors themselves, authority figures such as paramount chiefs, as well as civil society organizations, representatives of those. So it was quite a multi-stakeholder interviews, yeah. So just to say, the research question that has then motivated my research was, what explains the uneven use of international guidelines and codes of conduct in for responsible investment in Sierra Leone? And I argue that the conformity to international guidelines in investment cases is related to the land tenure regimes and the land governance structures in Sierra Leone, which vary across space. And more specifically, there are some variations in the customary land tenure regime, which I will explain later a bit more, which I will differentiate between unreformed and reformed. And this differentiation shapes how and to which extent international guidelines can gain traction or not. So just a very brief background here on the analytical framework and how I understand this differentiation. So in terms of administrative boundaries in Sierra Leone, there are 4 provinces: the Northwest, Northern, Southern, and Eastern province, as you can see here in the map on the left. And there's the Western area that's is around the capital of Freetown, the Freetown Peninsula. And there has historically been sort of a division, a dual land ownership structure. So the Western area has been governed under so-called statutory tenure, under freehold and leasehold tenure regimes, whereas the provinces have all been under so-called customary tenure. And that is based on the institution of chieftaincies, which are quite important in Sierra Leone. So you can see in the map on the right, there are 190 chiefdoms, and each chiefdom is headed by a paramount chief who has been historically seen as the custodian of land and is still quite an important sort of decision maker in the land realm. What I found was very interesting. So the literature on post-war developments in Sierra Leone, especially on land and politics, has indicated that the authority of paramount chiefs, the institution of paramount chiefs, has been severely weakened and diminished in the post-war era. This has partly to do with the sort of targeting of chiefs during the Civil War, as many were killed and forced to flee. And also legal administrative reforms that were pushed by the global donor community, who have taken hold in Sierra Leone to quite some extent, as I mentioned earlier, especially, for example, the 2004 Local Governance Act that inserted a new institution of elected local councils at the chiefdom level that was now supposed to sort of govern hand in hand with the chiefs. So a lot of the sort of authority of the chiefs themselves was sort of now put on other institutions. Yeah, but at the same time, there is a literature that indicates sort of the opposite of that, that there are still very powerful chiefs in certain regions. There's a lot of literature on the sort of continuation of very lucrative patronage networks and vested interest in high value natural resources, especially in the diamond mining industry in the east of the country, and especially there in Kono district in the eastern region. And that sort of the post-war reforms have not really taken hold there, and that the paramount chiefs are still very central, almost despotic figures of authority there. So that I found very interesting, and it led me to sort of look at this in a sort of differentiation between what I call a reformed customary tenure that is characterized by weaker paramount chiefs and actually stronger family authority over land decisions. And there, in cases of large-scale land investments on that kind of land, I found that chiefs took more of a background, a more symbolic role, whereas families living on the land were actually engaging directly with the investors and took on more authority in that sense. So a sort of bottom-up way of implementing investments. In contrast, where there were vested interests in natural resources, such as diamond mining, and in some other pockets of the country, I call this unreformed customary tenure, because there it seems that chiefs are very powerful and family authority is very weak. And in cases of investments in that kind of land, it seems that the paramount chief is implementing these investments or making the deals directly with central government actors or specific politicians and the investors themselves. So more of a top-down way of deal making. So this is kind of the framework. To try to put this very quickly into sort of geographical, in a geographical view here. So you can see the different land tenure regimes that I see in Sierra Leone. You see the yellow area here, the western area that contains the sort of freehold and leasehold statutory tenure. And then in dark green here, I indicated what I call the unreformed customary tenure in Kono district. And the rest of the country, I put in light green as sort of where this kind of reformed, or where indications are that things are changing and there's a reformed customary tenure. And the red stars indicate where my case studies are. Okay, so just to jump into the case studies a little bit, I won't have time to go into any specific case here in the framework of this presentation, but I just wanted to show the main features of variations that I found. And I do want to say at this point that I am not trying to advance a perfect causal argument of why one case of investment differs to the other. There could be many other sort of factors coming into that. It's just that there are several very consistent variations, systematic variations that I did find between cases of investment on the unreformed, so-called unreformed customary tenure and on the reformed. And I just want to kind of illustrate these a little bit. So I'm calling the main features of variation that I can really speak to are the scale of decision-making in land investments, the shape of the lease area, and the extent to which there was conformity to international guidelines or specific reference to this, as well as involvement of NGOs and activist groups in these cases. So to summarize this already up front here, so looking at the scale of decision-making, investment cases on unreformed customary tenure, such as the investments in Kona district, seem to be all brokered amongst a very small group of elites, often with a very central role of the paramount chief, together with government and investments themselves, often without the negotiations taking place even, or consent being sought from the communities or families on the ground, sometimes even without their knowledge. And then for investment cases on the reformed customary tenure, this is completely inverse, it's completely different. It's very localized. Individual families are making sort of leasing out their land directly to the investor, and the paramount chief seems to be taking sort of a mediating symbolic role in that process. Then for the shape of the lease area, and this I'm going to show you in a second, the maps or like bird's eye view of these areas are for investments on unreformed customary tenure. It's usually consistently a very large scale, single consolidated lease area. Sometimes an entire chiefdom has been leased out. And this is what they call a blanket lease on the ground. And on investment cases on the reformed customary tenure are very different. They look quite scattered. They're scattered plots of leased out land, which represent the individual lease agreements done with families directly with the investors. And lastly, the conformity to international guidelines and the involvement of NGOs. For cases on unreformed customary tenure, this is largely absent, or at least there was no specific reference made to them. In many cases, don't have a lot of sort of action by NGOs surrounding them or any kind of sort of activism around it. And this is completely the opposite on investment cases on the reformed customary tenure, where often cases are actually showcases and are illustrated as such for testing out specific guidelines, for showing how responsible investments can be made. There's lots of civil society groups involved and legal support to families, and very much this sort of watchdog function of civil society groups. If I still have time,
yeah,
I would just...
Carolyn, you have you've had about 11 minutes. Now,
okay, that's perfect.
You can
that's
have
perfect.
4 or 5
so,
minutes. Okay.
Yes. So just to kind of go just very quickly into each of these to illustrate this a bit more. So for the scale of decision making, just to give an example of the reformed, oh, sorry, this was supposed to say the unreformed customary tenure. Just want to read to you a quick quote of from one of my interviews with a group of section chiefs and town chiefs. So these are not paramount chiefs, but also sort of sub-authorities. And they have told me that the paramount chief, sorry, this is in the context of mining investments in Kona district, where chiefs are very powerful. And they said that the paramount chief oversees the distribution of the ground rent, knowing that whoever is important gets more than others. He decides. And they say the surface rent, it's ours to chop, which means in sort of Creole, in Sierra Leonean Creole, ours to chop means ours to eat, ours to use however we deem fit. It's basically ours. So they don't need to share these sort of benefits in a way, to say that more in a sketchy way. The exact opposite I found was true for the scale of decision making on reformed customary tenure. This is an example of a palm oil project called Natural Habitats, where I interviewed the paramount chief of the area, who very much took on a symbolic role. And he even told me that my role of paramount chief is that I'm the custodian of the land, although the land is owned by individual families. I don't own the land. So whatever decisions those families come up with regards to their land is what I have to protect, which very much shows that he sees himself also as a sort of almost providing a service to the families in his chiefdom to negotiate or mediate, but not to decide on their land. And then I wanted to show you quickly the juxtaposition between the shape of the lease areas, which I found very interesting and is sort of kind of a graspable, really, piece of evidence, like contrasting each other very strongly. So on unreformed customary tenure, I mentioned that there are usually very large scale blanket leases. So this is the Sokfin Agricultural Company, which is also a palm oil project. And you can see here on the right, the extent to which they have a very consolidated lease area, and the light green spots are representing some of the villages that are sort of like little islands within this sort of sea of palm oil plantations. And I think overall they have 18,000 hectares at the moment, which makes up the majority of the entire chiefdom in San Malen in the southern province. In contrast, on reformed customary tenure, here are two examples of Sierra Tropical, which is a pineapple farm, and Myro Forestry, which is a forestry project. You see the scattered little plots that represent individual lease agreements. So done with families directly. And then lastly, to just look at the conformity to international guidelines. So this was largely absent in cases on unreformed customary tenure, whereas it played a huge role on the reformed customary tenure. And just to read out a quick quote for the reformed customary tenure, I spoke to the Welthungerhilfe is a civil society organization in Freetown, who were actively supporting the project called Lizard Earth, which is a cocoa project. And she said, we are supporting this project in the hope that it will become a proof of concept for this kind of business model, but also, sorry, I can't actually read the, also for how to undertake responsible land investments generally, so that we can finally move away from the more theoretical discussion about land governance toward having a specific example to be able to say it's possible and it's also profitable. So this really shows how involved the international donor community and civil society organizations are in some of these projects on what I call the reformed customary tenure.
Caroline, your time's pretty much up. So any concluding words?
Yeah, concluding words. So just to summarize and show my conclusions a bit. So the two main points I did want to show or just draw attention to is that on the one hand, you have variations in customary tenure, which I found were mainly characterized by varying levels of authority of paramount chiefs, which may really shape the extent to which international guidelines may gain traction. On the other hand, you also had variations and uneven effects of these administrative legal reforms, which is very interesting that they were not, how they sometimes were able to take hold and sometimes not, and how strong vested interests of political elites may actually work to prevent or block reforms. And then to extrapolate from that a little bit, also in the context of this conference, what could be lessons for the global governance agenda, or could we look at international guidelines as sort of a solution or panacea? And I want to argue to that, well, not really, I want to say, because I do think that international guidelines and this idea of disciplining investors or teaching, this kind of like awareness raising and all that, it is an important aspect and can play an important role. But what I wanted to show with this project is also that we really do need to also start or understand the local land tenure structures, the intricacies of the governance and politics structures, and the history and politics of what we can find on the ground, how that actually plays into. So basically, global norms for responsible investment don't fall into a lawless void or something. There are structures on the ground that are very important in determining how these can be even effective or not. So the blueprint might be not working like that everywhere. Okay, I'm just going to leave it with that. Sorry for overtaking a bit, Julian.
No worries, Caroline. Thank you very much. That was a very clear presentation and a very interesting topic, very well presented. But we do need to move on quickly, so we won't pause for questions now. So I'm now going to ask Faria, if you're ready to take the floor and give your presentation on the unsettling debate around the Land Acquisition Act 1894 and the displacement that infrastructure development has caused in Pakistan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julian. And Caroline, your presentation was very interesting, and I really enjoyed your presentation. I have a few questions, but of course I'll ask at the end. So hello, everyone. I'm Faria Hashmat, and my co-authors for this presentation are Dr. Emma Nawaz, Hania Shabir, Aisha Subhani. So we'll be presenting on the Unsettling Debates of Land Acquisition Act, which is a colonial era act, and the displacements that are caused by the infrastructure development project. Okay, so broadly we'll be, I need to fix this, okay, that's fine. So broadly we'll be looking at the unsettling development and the land debates in our country, Pakistan, in context of this Acquisition Act. And more specifically, I'll be focusing on the issue of questionable land acquisition with regard to the recent human displacements that were caused by the construction of a mass transit project, which is Lahore Orange Line Metro Train project in an urbanized and densely populated city of Lahore. So I'll just give a brief overview. In every country, the government's role, of course, comprised the provision of basic services and infrastructure for sustainable development. Land, it must be provided for investments such as roads, railways, airports, harbors, etc. So in this case, large areas or large tracts of lands, they are required for the development projects. But the availability of land, it becomes an issue, especially in those areas which are densely populated. So the acquisition of both land and property, it is a difficult task that can result in several issues, which are, of course, more prevalent in underdeveloped or developing countries such as Pakistan. In this case, compulsory acquisition of land and property in our part of the world, in the global south, India, as well as Pakistan, it basically indicates the power of the government to acquire private rights in land without the willing consent of the owner for public purpose. However, compulsory acquisition is inherently disruptive in nature. Although it may be beneficial to the society, the social and economic development of the society, for example, the investment in infrastructure projects, it can bring benefits to the society. But it also occur in a way that can cause disruption, especially in terms of human displacement. And displacement, it tends to, it tends to uproot people from their households, businesses, they get uprooted, the social networks, they get disrupted. Moreover, the process of this compulsory acquisition, if it's poorly implemented, it has immense social, economic, and political costs. I'll just briefly explain the Land Acquisition Act. The Constitution, it's the constitutional framework which is used in Pakistan regarding the acquisition of land and property. It gives power to the state of eminent domain to appropriate or acquire land for any public purpose upon a provision of a just compensation. So I'll just briefly explain the main significant clauses of land acquisition that are associated with compensation and acquisition of land and property. The process, it basically begins by an agency which submits an application to a government official, thereby providing the justification for any acquisition of land and property for public purposes. Hence, under Section 4, a notification is issued to the public or to the concerned stakeholders whose land is to be acquired. And this notification, it contains all the relevant details of the area that is to be acquired. So the official then lawfully, he visits the sites and conduct a survey, but he doesn't have any right to enter a property without giving 7 days prior notice to the occupier. And if the authorized officer, he does any damage, he does cause any damage to the buildings or houses, so he is in return liable to pay an amount of compensation to the stakeholders. However, under Section 5, an official notice is published in the official gazette, which contains the detailed particulars of the land to be acquired. So in Pakistan, under the Land Acquisition Act, and for the sake of, for the purpose of provision of compensation, there was a need to establish a district price assessment committee. So the district price assessment committee, it basically deals with the valuation of land and the processes of cash compensation. The minimum rate that is set for land and property is the government rate, which we call the DC rate, but it is quite low compared to the market rate, the market value of land and property. So to settle this dilemma, the District Price Assessment Committee, it assesses the market rate and the DC rate of the entire area of the land or the property that is to be acquired, thereby categorizing the areas into various zones based on their price assessment. So for example, the price of agricultural land will be different from that of urban land or the semi-urban land. However, it's quite inefficient. So far, I've just explained briefly about the acquisition of land and provision of compensation and the role of District Price Assessment Committee. These are all clauses of Land Acquisition Act. However, in the Land Acquisition Act of 1894, there is no clause, no provision related to the resettlement or rehabilitation plans of those who are displaced. Moving on to explaining the process of land acquisition in Pakistan, I've already explained this slide. Even for the infrastructure development, till this date, the de facto law that is enforced for the acquisition of land and property is again the Land Acquisition Act. And the resettlement plans, they're based on ad hoc basis, since there is no clause pertinent to the resettlement or rehabilitation plan in the Land Acquisition Act. So against this backdrop, this research study will explore the inefficiency in the implementation of Land Acquisition Act in context of the recent displacement that is caused by the mass transit project, which is a 27-kilometer long mass transit project constructed in the densely populated area of the metropolitan city of Lahore. So this is the map for the Orange Line train. The orange line, as you can all see, it indicates the stations. There are 26, I'm sorry, it's a bit blurred, but these indicate the stations. Orange Line train comprised 26 stations. And as you can see, the area that I've circled in red, these two stations, they were constructed underground because these two areas, they were very densely populated. Hence, cut and cover technology had to be used, due to which the buildings, apartments, and everything that was on the ground, on the surface, it had to be demolished. So the maximum displacements that occurred, they were from these two areas, the stations of Central Station and Anarkali Station. Hence, our research objectives are to further the discourse on the inefficiencies, basically, in the inefficiencies in the implementation of Land Acquisition Act in context of this project. Secondly, we will be exploring the inefficiencies of this act through in-depth interviews of all stakeholders that will comprise effectives, the policymakers, regulators, even ordinary citizens, as well as people hailing from different professions. And finally, to propose informed policies and practices that are geared towards suitable resettlement and rehabilitation of the displaced. Similarly, the research question is that what is the stakeholders' perspectives on the inefficiency of land acquisition act in the wake of development-induced displacements. So to make this clear a bit, this research, I've conducted this research based on my MPhil thesis, and I'm presenting just a part of my MPhil research. So we revisited the key stakeholders that were involved in this project, and we interviewed them based on the land debates and the unsettling development that occur due to the acquisition of land. The methodology is qualitative in nature. We'll be employing a case study method for in-depth understanding of the issue in the implementation of this act. The collection of data comprise in-depth interviews with key stakeholders that we revisited in February for interviewing. And the interviews, they were recorded and they were transcribed accordingly. And for analysis, we are using the thematic analysis. So
Maria, you've had 10 minutes.
Okay,
so you only really have about 5 minutes more.
Okay.
You might want to focus on key findings or conclusions.
So these are my main themes. As you can see that we found that the law was obsolete. There were forced acquisition of land and property. There were no property rights. The issues with price assessment and provision of compensation and right to appeal. So I've already explained the colonial legacy and rehabilitation issue with this law, since it was made in 1894, so there is no rehabilitation policy. So these are some of the quotations that I've included in my presentation of the stakeholders and their views regarding this law. For example, one of the directors of Land Revenue Department, he was of the point of view that over the years, there hasn't been any attempt to update the Land Acquisition Act with in accordance with the contemporary challenges that are being encountered during the acquisition of land and property. And similarly, these are other quotations that I've included in my presentation, but due to lack of time, I'll just skip. And secondly, my second theme that we surfaced was the forced acquisition of land and property. So I interviewed some of the displaced families, 2 or 3 people from the displaced families, and they were of the point of view that the authorities, along with armed police, they started demolishing buildings and private properties while people were still inside. Although if we just saw previously that the acquisition of land and property under Section 4, it clearly says that if you can't just harm people, you just can't barge into anybody's property or anybody's home and, you know, start acquiring land through violence and etc. In case of property rights, the definition of an affected person here was the one who was legal title holder of the land. In this case, since people were situated in this area even before partition, so most of them, they had no documentation regarding title holders of land or etc. So obviously this has it had a harsh impact on the non-title holders of the land. So I'll just skip due to lack of time. Finally, the price assessment and provision of compensation. It was, obviously it's quite difficult to financially quantify all the non-economic losses that occur during the process of displacement and resettlement. Similarly, you can't quantify the non-economic losses into monetary terms. Moreover, poorly drafted laws and regulations, they create confusion, and there are more opportunities for the authorities to abuse those who are marginalized. For example, one of the displaced person, he said that a lack of standard and good governance practices, it allowed corrupt officials to provide favorable compensation to those who could offer bribes or those who had strong patronage networks and strong political connections. Similarly, the cases of compensation, they varied according to the type of area, household, socioeconomic status of the displaced household. Some people, they were adequately compensated compared to others, and some even received no compensation at all. In some cases, affected persons got the right to appeal, but their appeals, they were rejected, which encouraged them to resort to other forms of protests, which led to violence. In some cases, there were violations of stay order as well. So I'll just conclude my presentation. The first and foremost implication is that the Acquisition Act, it has to be updated. It needs to contain clauses pertinent to resettlement policy and plan, if they should be incorporated in the Act. And of course, involuntary resettlement should be avoided or minimized. Or, you know, if there are concerns regarding displacement, the authorities, they should look at alternative project designs. People who are marginalized, for example, those who are displaced, they should get jobs in the project so that their livelihoods can be restored and improved. Most importantly, displaced persons or the affectees, they should, prior to making them displaced, they should carry out a consultation session with such people and should involve them in planning and implementation process of the displacement. Similarly, in case of, if we look at the marginalized group, particular attention should be paid to the needs of these groups among the displaced, especially those who are children, women, and who belong to ethnic minorities. Compensation, it has to be, it may be appropriate where there are active markets for land, housing, and labor, and land and housing are sufficiently available where livelihoods are not land-based. There should be other forms of compensation as well. In Pakistan, only cash compensation is provided to those who are displaced. so there should be other forms of compensation like land compensation, or they should be provided for a separate house if their houses or properties are acquired. And lastly, eligibility is important because persons who are eligible for compensation, they include only those who have formal legal rights to the land. So they should also be, those who don't have legal title to the land, they should also be in one form or another, they should be assisted either through granting aids or through other forms of compensation. So I'll just quickly wind up, and thank you for your
Thank you very much, Faria, and well done for not going very much over time. I think that was a fantastic set of insights into the consequences of outmoded legislation and weak governance, and the impacts that that can have on people in an urban environment in that context. So thank you very much for that. We need to move on quite quickly to our next presenter, who will be Weizhu Yang from LSE. And Weizhu is going to present on property institutions and their explanatory power in relation to Chinese agricultural land investments in Zambia. So Weizhu, you have the floor.
Cool. Thank you, Julia, for introduction. And it's very nice to have our small group here. So I feel very safe to try out some argument of my thesis. And I find there's quite some overlapping of what I'm going to say with what Caroline and Freya has just said. So it's good. So we will in the end have a very good discussion. So I want to present just part of empirical chapter of my PhD dissertation. So I'm interested, and I'm sure as everyone here, I'm interested in property rights in land, and my research explores foreign, especially Chinese investors and their economic behaviors in response to various property rights regimes in African countries, the laws, the politics, and the policies. And for me, I find the nexus between the property institutions, as I see the supply side of the property rights, and the foreign investors who are the demand side of property rights. The interaction between these two are dynamic and fascinating. And I think the reason I find this very interesting and the dynamic interaction is worth investigating, because if as the literature is kind of prevalent by the efficiency theorists and their revisionists, who just argue, say, with the land values increase, the rational actors will try to create institutions that secure property rights, or from the demand side says the participants will create an interest in property security. But however, we didn't really see the secure property rights or universal land markets get any closer to realization in most of African countries and their realistic context. So at the same time, we see a lot of scholars try to question even the assumption of universal preference on secure property rights, as Ato Onoma wrote in his book on politics of property institutions, try to challenge, say, maybe actually it's a modes of expropriation and extract the value from land kind of defines the preference of either provide the secure or just ignore the institutions. We also have like scholars as Catherine Boone, which is also in our panel today, explores a very diverse land tenure regimes across time and space, which have their own expression at a different level, from local, subnational to national level in terms of political effect. But also we have the scholars as Yue Hou try to argue, say, with this given imperfect institutional setups, as we will see in most of African countries, maybe a selective property rights regime could be the first best solution for investor to protect their property rights rather than the very well-defined secured one, well-defined ones, because there's a lack of security or institution to provide that. So also in my research, I observe great variation regarding the timing, location, and forms of Chinese investment. And my finding suggests that the African countries' domestic land tenure rules create a variegated playing field of risk and opportunity that attracts different type of investors who it kind of depend on the investor, their own distinctive combination of accumulation logics and risk tolerance. So before I get back to my argument, I want to try to give a little background of the case of Zambia and the Chinese economic actors operating in the Zambia agriculture field. So, so in Zambia, we have various land tenure rules in place. So from British colonial rule, they established a bifurcated land governance, and this kind of survived till today. In recent 3 decades, we have 2 episodes of land complication, which is the first one is a land reform and economic liberalization in the 90s, which opens opportunity for foreign investors to access state land, which you see the green shades of land, the state land. And also it opens, the Land Act 995 opens opportunity for investors to convert customary land, which is a white shades land, to state land. What this means is, though investor has no legal access to any customary land in this white shades, but if they say, I just want to invest here, they can go through a long and prolonged process and bureaucratic and legal process to convert that piece of land to state category land, which will be under the leasehold private title deeds. And this kind of opens up, creates a third category of land tenure, which I call the transitional property rights. Also, the second episode of complication is the National Land Policy Review, which drafted in 2017, which proposed to restrict land tenure for investor from 99 years renewable long lease to 25 years short lease without guarantee of renewal. This is a little bit counterintuitive in think about state try to secure, provide secure property rights for to attract investors, because if they shorten up the tenure and without guarantee renewal, it's for investors, they will perceive as a huge increase of insecurity. So let's move on to the economic side. I want to go through this very quickly. So for Chinese economic actors, they equip with different capital and interest. So on the right side is the typical individual or family investors. They usually own 1 hectare or at most 10 hectares of land, and from their family support or saving to purchase that land. Or on the left side, we have the state-owned farm and the private investors, which ranges from 40 to 4,000 hectares. And they usually either financed by the commercial loan, commercial bank, or the Chinese state financing to support the initial investment to purchase the land and to establish the quite expensive pivot irrigation system. So here is where I try to focus on in this presentation. It's a working theory of the prediction. I hope I can borrow your brain and give it a check out. So on the top head, I have the competition between the state authority and the local authority over land. As we see in the Zambia case, we have the state-owned land as the green shades and the customary land as the white shades. And they're governed by different authorities, either state agents, Ministry of Land or some of under Ministry of Agriculture, or the Waishits, customary land is governed by the local authority like the chiefs. And this competition manifests on the cost information of interest on land and transaction costs. So what I want to emphasize here is I'm not really saying that the chieftain or the landowner chief will necessarily increase the transactional cost or something, but as long as there's a unified control either by the chief or the state, they can either provide like fast free land market, cater to certain participants, or they can just manipulate the market as they prefer. But for my discussion about the foreign investors, due to the constraint of their access, they only have access to either the state land, which under the state control, or they try to convert land, which will be the transitional property right. So in the transitional property right regime, we will encounter this confront between the authority try to let go of the land and the state either want to take or just don't really care to convert the land from the chiefs. I hope it makes sense. So on the left side I try to say it's a court or tribunal that adjudicates the land disputes, and so we will see usually the most preferred one, of course, is established formal court and tribunal provides the legal instruments to defend investors' property rights. But we do see in the literatures that when there's imperfect legal system, there are always some informal formal methods or instruments coming up, either to build alliance or have connections or this source to protect their property rights. And so with this for my table, so in this one is quite the least likely case scenario to attract investment, in which the investor will both face the high transaction cost as well as they have limited option to defend their property. This is, as I would argue, maybe the case of investor try to convert the village land in Tanzania, but I'm not going to get into that today. But on the flip side, in the first quadrant is the most conventional prediction of the efficient market, which describes a property rights regime that featured with unified state control and protection. And as my fieldwork data shows, most of Chinese agricultural investment, actually, they do happen there in this state regulated and protected land market. So as you see, in the timing slides, so from the land reform liberalization till the point before the draft on national land policy to make the uncertain legal reform. In this period, this is most of the investment, Chinese agricultural land-based investment happening. And also in terms of where they happened, this is investment happens also mostly on the green shade, which is a state land. So does this mean, so this somehow make us think, okay, it seems like people do love secure property rights, but what this thesis try to argue more is there is these two unexplained boxes, which kind of depict two types of different property regimes that's worth some investigation. So, lower here, lower left, which it depicts a property right regime that is captured by natural resource nationalism and increasingly centralized state control. This means, although the transaction costs are low, since investors only have to deal with state to negotiate with the state to acquire land, but at the same time, they potentially face higher risk of state expropriation and less protection for their property right. So in the Zambia, this property right regime exists periodically and spatially dispersed. It was the thing in the Zambia Second Republic and emerged again in the late 2010s with the draft national land policy that we see. So there are like state also spatially dispersed, because there are some state initiated spatial development zones that also fit into this category. And what I'm trying to argue from the investor side is the investment is likely to happen as long as investors, they do have the instruments to defend their property or they are able to exist with the least cost. So in this case, there would be type of other competitors in this very unsecure or high risk of expropriation regimes. And I have some case for this.
Weizhu, you've had about 12 minutes, and I think at most we can let you have 5 minutes more.
Okay, thank you. I think that's more than enough. So for this case, this kind of, in this type of property regimes, I have like 2 cases, and they all invested by the Chinese-owned engineering group. And even I want to focus on this one because this is like the least desirable situation. They have this uncertain possible legal change in terms of land law, land tenure, but also they happen on the state converted land with like high risk of state expropriation. But this Chinese state-owned engineering group still, as this very undesirable situation, be able to sit down with local provincial governors to negotiate deals, because they have formed over last decades a good relationship with local government, and they are confident with their informal instruments to defend their property right in the long run. And and in this quadrant 4, the last one is a type of property regimes that they have 2 incentives for investors to engage land conversion. First, in the broader national economy, they have their huge freedom, economic freedom, and legal situation to incentivize the investors to convert land at below market price. In this way, to capture the potential high return, and at the same time, the state is a pro-land conversion state, which provides protection on land that has been converted to private land category from customary land. So this means once a conversion succeeds, even though the process might be very prolonged, but once it succeeds, the investor will have a guaranteed strong defense of their property right under the state-run court and the tribunal. So in this scenario, investment is likely, as I will argue, as long as investors, they have the big stomach to taking the risk with these 2 given incentives. And I do have a case D. Do I have one? Okay, so so at the moment, I don't have any like land-based agricultural projects that happen on customary land, but so many failed attempts to try to do this conversion. But all of them have the informal connection with public official here or there. And I want to give you 2 examples which to depict where the failure of conversion happened. The first one is happen as a process of proceed the conversion in the Ministry of Land. So one investor here, you can see here, it's not in any green shades. It's a customary land, and the investor is like a highly well-connected Beijing-based investment firm. They try to convert a piece of land, but because the change of government around that time, he lost his connection. So this conversion never really went through. So as my interview, participants also show in the Ministry of Land, there's a divided opinion in terms of how to govern the land. Some really prefer a land bank, universal land bank, and unified control by the Ministry of Land of every territory in Zambia. But also some of them think actually it's better to keep the bifurcated land governance, to keep the central government on check. Another type of failure happened as a local authority. It's mostly heard about asking for bribes and a broken deal with the local chiefs. And this kind of give you some idea of the different response from the local authority, from the chiefs. And usually in the Lusaka areas, like Lusaka urban area and brought to the central province, we have chiefs, they guard their land as their own babies. Some of them, they are willing to discuss business and promote certificate, secure tenure, but with condition, which means they want to guard their land within their jurisdiction, which means they want to secure tenure, but without transfer rights. So investors go in, deal with lease the land from the chiefs, but never do not convert the land to the state category. And but also we have another diverse case around in this area, which is have some report and rumors saying maybe there is possibility of converting large tribal customer land because maybe at this area, like there's less opportunity of have an indirect revenue from the land, but just selling it for profit. But that's not really happening. I just heard a report or rumor about that. So
sorry to interrupt, but your time's pretty much up. So
okay,
if you could perhaps try to move to your conclusion.
Here is I want to say this diverse preference by the chiefs kind of we observed here agree with the introduction I mentioned, the work by autonomous argument on different modes of land exploitation by the leader. The different modes lead to the divergent preference for design of property institutions. And in this subnational local argument, I find the central argument from 90s to 2010 had an interest in strengthening private property institutions till some point that it wants some land back, like we see in the National Land Policy 2017, the proposed one. And the provincial government has an interest in neglecting the customer property institution to ease the land conversion for government revenue to establish the development project like special economic zones. But at the same time, it will encounter the pushback from the local chiefs, which demand more secure, yet without transfer rights to keep revenue within their customer jurisdictions. Thank you. I will just end here.
Thank you very much, Weizhu. Very interesting. A lot of detail, and you did well to convey the background and the detailed real variation that there is and complex institutional processes involved in Zambia. So we'll move now to the final paper, which is from Isaac Haruna Ziaba, also another PhD candidate from LSE, Chieftaincy Institutions and Mineralized Land Mediation in Ghana. So Isaac, we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Please, floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Can you see my slides?
Yes, maybe you could enlarge the screen a bit because they're cut off at the top. We can see the key. We can see the title. Yeah, fantastic.
Is it better?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Before I start, I would like to apologize for the technical challenges. I am actually not in the house. I traveled somewhere for some program, and so I'm in a hotel presenting now. Therefore, it's likely you might have some feedback from the hotel guest. It's something I cannot control, and so please pardon me for that.
Okay, no worries.
Unfortunately, the internet connection in my room is so bad that I have to come to the reception to kind of, do this presentation. So my apologies in advance for any inconveniences. All right, I hope that's not part of my time though. So my name is Isaac, like he said. I'm going to present this paper, which I am jointly kind of working on with a colleague from Leeds University by name Alicia Ofori Dida. And we present our work title, Chieftaincy Institutions and Mineralized Land Mediation in Ghana. So in this presentation, I'm going to look at the motivation, the research question, the existing scholarship, the research design methods, the analytical framework, the argument, the evidence, and then conclusion. So in Ghana, as regards land and mineral rules, there are clear rules as to who owns what. As a matter of fact, 100% of subsurface land rights belong to the state. And the Minerals and Mining Act, Act 703, 2006, vests all minerals or subsurface land rights in the modern state, in this case, the Ghanaian state. So there are clear rules as to who owns the mineral resources. Yet customary authorities, henceforth chiefs, transact subsurface land for illegal miners and get away with it. And so this chiefly behavior kind of confounds the institutional theory, because according to Douglas North, institutions are humanly devised constraints that kind of shape or drive the way people interact. And so according to the theory of institutions, we would have expected chiefs to conform, but they are not conforming. They are actually transacting mineralized lands outside of their customary authority. And so the research question that emerges for interrogation is that why do chiefs broker unlicensed or illegal miners access to mineralized lands, and how and why do they, i.e. the chiefs and the miners, evade prosecution? Because there are clear rules regarding who should be prosecuted when, the fact that people should be prosecuted when they facilitate illegal mining or when they engage in it. But we haven't seen any such prosecution, particularly with regard to chiefs. So existing scholarship trying to kind of explain the motivation for chiefly involvement in, if you like, illegal mining or mediating access to illegal mining suggests that the material interests of chiefs, matter. In other words, chiefs engage in facilitating illegal mining because of their material interest. But I think this particular explanation a bit simplistic, if not problematic, because the question arises as to why chiefs would trade off their social reputation for material interest in illegal mining. Moreover, why and how chiefs, evade prosecution is severely under-researched. And so we would like to look at why Ghana, out of the several resource countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, such as DRC, Tanzania, Burkina Faso, Mali, and what have you, we believe that Ghana, is a deviant case in that it defies existing institutional theories. So, like I said before, mineral institutions, as we have seen in Ghana, do not seem to constrain chiefly behavior. Ghana is also a typical case in that it represents or potentially represents a much larger population of cases. So, like much of Sub-Saharan Africa, gold mining in Ghana preceded colonialism. And the pre-colonial gold mining was mostly artisanal, and Ghana's chieftaincy institutions, moreover, have always been robust and entrenched in society, as we can also observe in other African countries. And so we believe that understanding the dynamics in Ghana with regard to the chiefly involvement in facilitating small-scale mining can shed or eliminate a larger population of cases, hence our focus on Ghana. In terms of the data collection, we relied heavily on a review of historical data, both published and archival. Sorry, my slides are misbehaving. Just a second. Yeah, so we relied heavily on historical data, like I said before, but also on 6-month triangulated interviews across relevant stakeholders, such as chiefs, artisanal miners, mineral management bodies, such as the Minerals Commission and the EPA, local government units, mining communities, and subnational police officers. We believe that these respondents have been purposefully sampled because their worldview would help us really unravel the puzzle that we've highlighted before. It seems like when I enlarge it, there is a problem changing the slides, but okay, it's okay now. So we would like to kind of, provide a potential. Oh, sorry, please. We'd like to provide some kind of, analytical framework to help us make sense of the puzzle that we see in Ghana, the fact that chiefs are engaging in facilitating illegal mining when they are not supposed to be doing that, So we draw on a theory of institutional change and power relations, And as James Robinson has argued, institutions tend to be highly inertial and change resistant. And yet institutional power can certainly change in the context of major critical junctures. In the case of Africa, the post-colonial period was a major critical juncture. As a matter of fact, in the post-colonial era, there was some kind of tense relations that emerged between post-colonial institutions and customary institutions. Customary institutions, as the literature suggests, in much of Africa enjoyed, if you like, a monopolized kind of right in ordering society in the pre-colonial period for obvious reasons. But even in the colonial period, particularly in the case of West Africa, colonial elites could not really, govern society without seeking the collaboration and the acquiescence of chiefs. Okay, so during the post-colonial period, there's some kind of tense power relations that emerged between post-colonial institutions and customary institutions. Surprisingly, the post-colonial elites that emerged, to kind of govern post-colonial institutions were themselves subjects of customary elites, but also masters of a customary elite, if that makes sense. So theoretically, customary institutions would contest more than once over the ordering of social relations, including access to land. So we believe that this can help us make sense of what is happening in Ghana with regard to the role of chiefs in mediating access to land. So our arguments are twofold. With regard to why chiefs mediate illegal miners' access to mineralized lands, we argue that chiefly mediation of mineralized land acquisition reflects power struggles to reassert long-lost customary authority over mineral resource governance and the benefits thereof. And concerning why chiefs and their clients evade prosecution, we suggest that the embeddedness of chiefs in the Ghanaian society and the veneration associated with chieftaincy institution constitute major bargaining chips by which chiefs and their clients, i.e. illegal miners or unlicensed miners, are able to evade law enforcement. And so in the next couple of slides, we are going to provide evidence, historical and contemporary, through interviews to kind of support our argument. So in the pre-colonial era, like I said before, customary institutions kind of had complete access over mineral resource governance. So in the case of Ghana, chiefs held inalienable rights over land and minerals on behalf of their communities, and they could also levy taxes. So in terms of gold extraction, a 50% tax was levied. In terms of gold jewelry, which is part of the value chain, 20% tax was levied. Community members, on the other hand, had unrestrained access to mine because they didn't need to really apply for any licenses in the pre-colonial era. So as long as they respected customary tax system, they had unrestrained access to mine. So in essence, gold ownership and production were strictly localized, whereas gold trade was dominated by European merchants for obvious reasons because they had the capital to be able to buy the gold products from the local producers. So we're going to look at the colonial institutions and resource governance. So we realize that within the colonial period, chiefs kind of, the powers of chiefs over mineral resources kind of, shed off a little bit. So between the periods of 1874 and 1956, which was the colonial period, there was some kind of collaborative institutions over mineral resource governance. So chiefs had the right to be able to kind of transact mineralized lands officially, recognized by colonial authority, to even foreign mining companies. Hence, the Mining Rights Regulation Cap 128 of 1905 defined mineral concession as any writing whereby any right, interest, or property in or over land with respect to minerals, precious stones, or the option of acquiring any such right, interest, or property or purpose to be either directly or indirectly granted by a native. So there was no question about the collaboration between colonial institutions and customary institutions over mineral resource governance. And here are some typical mining-related payments made to chiefs in the colonial period, including consideration money, occupation or ground rent, and mining or working rent. Moreover, customary payments also included royalties, and about 75% of all royalties were paid to native grantors, including chiefs. However, unlike the pre-colonial period, the local participation, i.e. artisanal and small-scale mining, was restrained by the 1909 Gold Mining Products Protection Ordinance, which required that for anybody to want to do mining by native methods, which is artisanal mining, they needed to apply for licenses via the Minister of Police. Thus, in the colonial period, mineral ownership was partially localized in that, chiefs were recognized in terms of transacting mineralized lands for foreign companies. whereas participation was completely alienated for reasons cited above. Now, I bring this table to give you a sense of how the post-colonial and neoliberal institutions of mineral resource governance are similar, but also different. However, both marginalized chiefs in terms of excluding them from mineral ownership. So the 1962 Minerals Act will represent the post-colonial institution for resource governance, whereas the 1986 Minerals and Mining Act would represent the neoliberal institution of mineral resource governance, which really hasn't changed from what we have now, which is the 2006 Minerals and Mining Act. So, unlike the 1962 Minerals and Mining Act, which kind of reserved all mineral rents for the state, the 1986 Minerals Act only reserved 2% of royalties for chiefs. Both acts exclude chiefs from mineral ownership. However, while the 1962 Minerals and Mining Act prescribed ASM altogether, ASM here means artisan and small-scale mining, the Minerals and Mining Act of 1986 kind of made some legal recognition for ASM. Yet people could not really do artisan and small-scale mining because under the 1986 Minerals and Mining Act, people had to apply for licenses, and for there is an abundance of research that suggests that the bureaucracy surrounding license application was a demotivation for people from applying for licenses. So in essence, the post-colonial and neoliberal institutions are quite similar in that they exclude chiefs from mineral resource governance, but also make it difficult for local participation in terms of small-scale mining, therefore creating a sense of opportunity for chiefs and illegal miners to kind of go underground to engage in informal mining.
Isaac, you have, in fact, about 3 minutes left, but if you could take no more than 5 to wind up, that would be great.
Some of these, interviews that I had, which gives us a sense of how chiefs are trying to reassert their customary authority over mineralized lands. So during an interview with the Minerals Commission, the point was made that it is the chiefs who are doing the galamsey, that is the illegal mining. Chiefs are the owners of the land, so no one can do mining without, consulting them. And an interview with a chief also revealed that the land belongs to the chiefs. And before the white men came here, we controlled the land and minerals, so we can use it as we please, and no politician, not even the president, can stop us. And so mineral institutions are in a sense meaningless to chiefs, as chiefs draw on their traditional and pre-colonial rights over land to legitimize their mediation of mineralized lands. And this is my last but one slide. Chiefs are able to evade prosecution mostly because of their social capital, which serves as a bargaining chip, for them to evade prosecution, but also negotiate a bill for illegal miners. So these interviews kind of provide evidence to this particular, sub-argument. An interview with the Minerals Commission revealed that we should be arresting them, that is chiefs, but no arrest has been done so far because they think they are chiefs, they think they are immune to prosecution. And a police officer also suggested that when a chief comes to ask you for a bill for an illegal miner, you would obey him out of respect for his tool. This frustrates our work. Similar, responses were given by the Environmental Protection Agency, but also focus group interviews with artisanal miners in Obuasi, which I would like to kind of mention. When an illegal miner is arrested, he knows that the chief would definitely come to his rescue. And so to conclude, in terms of the theoretical implications of this study, I think this study tells us that the history of legal and political processes surrounding institutional change can tell us much about the constraining effects of institutions as we have today. And in terms of the empirical and policy implications, we suggest that abating or reducing informal mining or illegal mining requires chiefly acquiescence, and that Ghana's probably the minerals and mining law could be revised to acknowledge and reserve a place for chiefs in natural resource governance, as was the case in colonial period. Looking beyond Ghana, we believe that our findings have relevance for resource-endowed African countries with robust chieftaincy institutions and systems and a history of radical post-colonial mineral institutional changes. And so we believe that this is an area that future researchers could probably explore in terms of looking at how chiefs, chieftaincy institutions play out in terms of mediation access to mineralized lands in other African countries. So with this said, we would like to thank you so much and welcome your suggestions in a way that will help us, refine this paper for potential publication. Thank you so much.
Excellent, Isaac. Thank you for a very clear presentation and very interesting insights into historical processes of institutional change in the mining sector in Ghana and their implications. Thank you very much. Well, we've had 4 good, extremely interesting papers presented. I think each presenter certainly deserved at least the extra 5 minutes that they had in order to complete presenting, and thank you for keeping more or less to time and for speeding up and transmitting your key points very well and very clearly, all of you. We now have less than 25 minutes for discussion. So I hope that we can give everybody an opportunity to respond to questions. I think I haven't really been monitoring questions in the chat. And there may not, actually looking at it now, there may not have been many. So I would ask anybody with questions or comments to make on any one or more of the papers to please come forward, raise your hand. I can see one hand already from Portia. Do we have any other people? Catherine, any other questions for a first round? In which case, let's hear from Portia and then from Catherine and then Rajanya. And then we'll see if we have time for a second round. So Portia, please.
Hi, thanks so much to the speakers for really great presentations. It's clear that there's a kind of common research agenda evolving across the presentations as well. I hope I have questions for all of the papers, so I hope I can deliver them sort of succinctly, but if I do take too long, Julian, you just tell me and I'll stop. So for Carolyn, I have a couple of kind of small questions that are probably addressed elsewhere in the PhD, and this is probably the risk of presenting so late in your PhD that you have so much and you're just showing us like a tiny bit of it. I kind of needed some clarification or problematization of the like family-led tenure, because I wasn't sure if you were using family in like a specific Sierra Leonean, like something that meant something specific in that land tenure regime, or if it's just sort of like a politically nice sounding, like, oh, like working families sort of thing. So like, is there a specific like lineage based land control, or is it just like, it means like the smallholders or the individuals who work the land? And I know that, and then I had a broader question about kind of what it was you were trying to explain. So I recognize that you said that this isn't meant to be like a causal theory. But part of your explanation did seem to be like, what explains the variation in the quality or the kind of international acceptability of these land investments? And then the answer seemed to be, well, it depends whether they're in a reformed or an unreformed land regime context. And I was wondering, is that just a kind of epiphenomenal consequence of whether they were like reformable or unreformable provinces? So is there like are all of the things you're talking about traceable back to like these earlier characteristics that also determined whether or not there was effective reform? Or do you have cases like provinces or chieftains that you wouldn't have expected to see effective reform, but did, and then that kind of consequently was able to override certain political factors? So I don't know if that's clear. Hopefully that's kind of.
Okay, do you have burning questions for other people, okay, Portia?
Okay, let me make it way quicker then. So Maria, I was wondering what the most surprising aspect of your findings were, because some of what you detailed was like depressing but quite widespread. We're used to seeing displacement and poor institutionalization. So what was the thing that sort of stood out about the specific Lahore case? For Isaac, I found your question kind of boring and your answer really interesting. So I'm wondering if you can maybe talk more about the literature. Why should we be surprised that chiefs are doing things that aren't set out in national law? Like, why should we be surprised that they're participating in illegal mining? I wasn't convinced by that part. But then I thought it was really interesting how you said it's not just about patronage and material interest, it's more about kind of authority and the power to kind of impose your right to govern. So yeah, maybe more on the kind of literature background there.
Okay, thank you, Portia. Catherine, you're muted.
I'm
you're
here. No,
unmuted.
I'm here. So thanks to all the presenters. I found this all extremely interesting. I'm going to do follow Portia a little bit and just asking each of the presenters a few questions. So Carolyn, I have two questions. One is whether the variation in the cases, the categories of cases, can be explained by the investment type. You know, so you have mining, and then you have palm oil, and you have pineapples. And I think, you know, mining, you can kind of see how someone could not negotiate a patchwork of agreements with families if you want to like do a massive strip mine or something like that. Whereas palm oil, you know, is an industrial, you know, very well suited to industrial plant, where pineapple, you know, you can get more of the outgrower. Anyway, you know, there's different, let's say, features of the production process in each case that could explain the variation. Secondly, you know, I had the same reaction that Portia did. You know, you're kind of saying, well, you know, there's just some really strong chiefs in Sierra Leone, so they didn't get reformed. But, you know, more critical view could say, you know, Sierra Leone, post-war Sierra Leone's, you know, embedded in the international political economy in different ways. In some parts of Sierra Leone, you have, you know, DFID and the reformers. And in other parts of Sierra Leone, you have these rapacious, you know, extractive mining multinationals in cahoots with, you know, or, you know, in tight alliance with the national government, which is in cahoots with these corrupt, decentralized despots, you know, and so that indeed it's all part of a process of how Sierra Leone, you know, this, let's say, contradictory process, which then raises a question. I think we've talked about it before, about whether, you know, the international backers are just sort of closing their eyes to the rapacious and exploitative behavior of their allies in parts of the country where they feel like they just can't do anything. So anyway, I assume the calls for more political explanation. In Faria's work, I commend you for this important work, and it seems like you're really giving voice and creating a foundation for, you know, the possibility of a legal challenge or activism, or the possibility of creating a basis for progress over the colonial law, as you described it. One question I had for you is whether the research itself was politically dangerous. What caught my ear is when you said you recorded people, you recorded your informants. So I just wondered, wow, are they not afraid to be recorded, and et cetera? So I was very intrigued by the context. I guess maybe another, you know, it sort of shades into the issue of whether you think there is a pathway for, you know, legal reform within the legal, you know, how politicized would that be, and what would be the larger political context? Yue Zhou, on your 2x2 about the dispersion or concentration of authority on the horizontal axis, you have competition between chiefs and states over land. But it seems like, you know, a lot of the literature focuses on the opposite, the collusion between chiefs and states. So I just wondered, like, you know, how you theorize this a priori structural competition between the two. I think I understand there's different legal regimes, but I think like the extent to which there's competition or collusion could be an important variable. But anyway, maybe just how do you think about that? And for Isaac, you know, I had the same reaction as Portia. To say institutions always constrain behavior, so then it's a paradox that chiefs don't. I think it doesn't work, because if institutions always constrain behavior, there would be no such thing as crime. There would be no crime in the world anywhere. So, you know, in other words, it's impossible to say that that's what North could mean. So I think, you know, as Portia was suggesting, it goes to more to explain, you know, why which rules are followed and why some are at some times and not at other times, or the particular, you know, configuration of rules that do or do not constrain, and what informal rules may be facilitating. It sounded to me like what you were talking about was not respect for the chiefs, but just a lot of corruption and breakdown of government authority over, control of ASM and natural resource use in the zones you were talking about. So that would be a kind of a different take on the phenomena you described. So it'd be interesting to hear your reaction to that.
Okay, thank you, Catherine. Rajanya, you had at least one question, I think.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is for Faria and one for Isaac. So for Faria, I wanted to ask that because in India too, we had the same 1894 Land Acquisition Act that you spoke about. And there was many decades of very strong resistance, a very legalization of the resistance as well. There were multiple court cases against both legitimacy of the eminent domain principle, as well as, say, for example, even definition of a just compensation, or even justification of why should the state displace people on behalf of sometimes even, say, private capital. So I was just wondering if you could give a glimpse into what the space of this resistance or discussion or discourse around this act is, because all of us know what the implications of such a bad colonial act is. I just wanted to know what the situation is right now. And even in the policy space, are there new bills being discussed? Does the parliament or court anywhere discuss it? Just a glimpse into what the space of resistance is. And for Isaac, I wanted to understand, maybe because I don't know much about what you spoke about, and it was a great presentation, but I wanted to understand about who are the other stakeholders in this illegal mining other than, say, the chiefs, because it must be sold somewhere, and there could be, say, other political leaders or even other corporate capital, like other parties would be involved in keeping this illegal mining or sustaining this illegal mining. So I just wanted to know a little bit about who the other stakeholders are, to just perhaps to explain better why this goes on, and explain this beyond just the participation of chiefs in what for them otherwise must look like an unjust institutional framework. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we've got a set of very interesting questions there for each panelist. In theory, we only have 10 minutes for discussion, but I'm not sure what the rules are, but perhaps Rajanya can allow us a bit of flexibility. But I think we'd better try to be quite prompt. And I'll give initially 2 or 3 minutes to each presenter to respond, and we'll take you in the same running order as we had. So if we could start with Carolyn, we had a number of questions for you. If you have them clearly, please respond.
Okay, thanks very much for the questions. Those were indeed very to the point. I'm going to also try to go by the list that I got them from. So Portia, you were asking me about my mentioning of the family-led tenure, and that is actually, I should have maybe explained that better. In the Sierra Leonean context, I was referring to actual family holdings on land. So there are big lineage structures and all that. I wasn't just meaning communities or small scale farmers or something. So technically land is owned by families in Sierra Leone, but then the chiefs are sort of the custodians. And the way that has been interpreted has varied widely. As sort of chiefs taking a landlord role on, but it's actually families who own the land. And this is coming out more and more now in the what I term the sort of reformed customary tenure, where that is honored much more. And to your second question, kind of Kathy's second question actually about what am I actually trying to explain. I think that is a very crucial point that I still have to keep working on. Yeah, so I do talk about this sort of contradictory process, but I think what I wanted to emphasize as well is not that that, you know, where the quality of the codes of conducts are better or worse or anything. I think what I wanted to highlight, maybe it didn't come across very well, was that there is this variegated terrain, these this unevenness. For example, legal reforms have taken hold or not across the country, and different sort of constellations of local politics that are there, and that there's often this notion of guidelines coming in, and if you could just stretch the guidelines to every part of the country, then you basically achieve development, or you achieve these good outcomes. But that it's not necessary, these developments are not necessarily driven by, or cannot be driven by, donors pushing these guidelines as such, but also to recognize that there are these political constellations, this unevenness, this variation, variegated landscape already there, and where that comes from, and the politics that underline that actually plays a much larger role, perhaps. I don't know if I'm explaining this too clearly, but just because I have very, very few minutes here, to answer the other question that Kathy asked, whether variation could be also explained by the sector, basically, if we're talking about palm oil, mining, pineapples, surely. So I do think that's also definitely not to be ignored. However, it goes beyond that, I would say. So for example, mining concessions, technically you need if the kimberlite mining or something, you need a dam or all these things, but you don't need necessarily 4 chiefdoms spanning 150 square kilometers necessarily. So these are large scale concessions that are given to mining companies, especially for the exploration licenses at times, that are completely not necessarily not based on where the diamonds actually are. So it's kind of, it goes beyond that, I would say, that it's not only based on exactly how much space is needed for a certain operation. So there's definitely political underpinnings here of just granting out, leasing the entire chiefdoms to a company, for example. But yeah, I will definitely need to take that more into account as well. I think I'll stop here because I want to give the others a chance. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. Faria, if you're ready, would you like to respond to the questions posed to you? What was most surprising?
Well,
was it politically dangerous? Yeah,
okay, I'll answer Catherine's question first regarding whether it was politically dangerous or not. Yes, of course, it was a political project in Pakistan, the Orange Line train. So while interviewing the respondents, we were very careful regarding the ethics. We took their approval that whether they are willing to give us their interviews or not. In my interviews, I also interviewed some political person who were associated with this project. So yes, there was a very, you can say in the backdrop, there was a political game as well in this project, but we were quite, vigilant regarding not to, surface the issue of politics in this regard. So yes, it was politically dangerous, but we were quite cautious in this regard. And Rajnia, you asked about the face of resistance and is there any bill that is being passed in the parliament in Pakistan? So in India, people are very much aware regarding their rights related to the Land Acquisition Act or the payment of compensation. Contrary, in Pakistan, awareness levels are very low. People are not very much cognizant about their rights, especially those who belong to low social economic strata. They're like the ones who were displaced in the case of Orange Line Metro Train project. The people who I interviewed even during my MPhil research in the year 2018, 19, and 20, majority of them, they were not, well educated and they had no idea about this act or the provision of compensation. So on the contrary, the informal networks like the unions or the civil society or the activists, they exerted influence on these people and they were the ones who made them aware regarding their rights. So in such cases, they all stood up and there were some resistance movements on their part. As far as, due to lack of time, I'll just quickly go over the answers. So as far as the case is concerned, whether there are any bills being passed in the parliament related to this act, well, there was a bill which was passed in the 80s, but again, because it's kind of a political game in Pakistan. So the bills, whatever bill it's passed, it gets repeated. So after some time, or either it's not implemented, it's there in the papers, but the implementation again, it's based on bribes or corruption in this case. So politics is greatly involved, but again, I didn't mention such because in academia we try not to dig much into these political concepts. And I think Dr. Emin Nawaz is here. He can answer Portia's question, my co-author. Yes, he's here.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, hi, everybody. You're hearing me, everybody? My voice?
Yes, sorry, I was muted.
Okay,
Hi,
good.
please.
Okay. Yeah, okay, Julian. Yeah, actually, I just continue from where Faria left regarding Rajinya's question. Actually, the issue with Pakistan is that it's not that people, they are not really aware of the fact, but it's very deep rooted. We haven't yet, I mean, compared to the other South Asian countries like India and Bangladesh, they have done the land reforms too early, like 25 years ago, and still we haven't yet able to do that. So that is exactly the thing, that all the rules and regulations, they have to be passed by the formal institutions, and over there the representation matters. So if there are no land reforms, so that means large land holdings belong to even so much feudalistic culture, they have their representation in the formal bodies. So of course, pretty understandable, we all are political economy students, that no one want to lose the power, because it is associated with kickbacks and commissions and fortunes in the future. So it's really it's a long shot. It will take some time. It really depends on those who are at the helm of affairs, who have to make rules. So probably things are changing like this. The whole episode of this displacements, that has brought the whole issue again at the forefront. But again, things are changing. But again, it depends on we haven't done yet the land reform. So that is probably the reason that in terms of institutional development in this land reforms areas, we are lagging behind other South Asian countries. Regarding the Catherine's question, I would like to add, I think Faria has already explained it. Actually, what we did is, this is just one part of this Faria's research, and it was conducting the whole in-depth interviews like 3 or 4 months ago. Now that process of displacement, that was started back in 2017, and by the 2020, all the cases of displacement they have done and dusted, they have resettled over there. So I don't think that there would be any issue regarding recording. People were very they're not skeptical about because everything has already been done. So I don't think that there would be any issues in interviewing people, and they are willing to respond to the questions. Now, coming back to, I think, Portia's question. Portia, could you just again say it again, your question, please? Yeah, I couldn't understand at that.
Can I just ask Rajanya, are we able to hang on for another 10 minutes to allow the other presenters to respond?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. In which case, let's continue this debate for a little while. I saw Catherine was also raising her hand. Okay. So you were about to respond to Portia, I think.
Portia, yeah, but I couldn't get the point. Portia, could you say it again, please?
Yeah, so I work on Nigeria, and there are really similar cases of like a metro line displacing people as part of urban renewal. And I was just wondering, in your research, did you come up, like, what do you think is a kind of Pakistan or the Lahore specific dynamics? Is there something that sets it apart or adds to our understanding of this sort of urban displacement on top of the kind of dystopian stories that we're quite used to in the literature?
Yeah, actually, Lahore, yes. The thing is, well, if you see from the context of development perspective, of course, development, that means, it has to be, the benefits should have to be broad-based. But Yes, in Lahore, if you just consider Lahore relative to the other areas, particularly in the Pakistan, Lahore is already a very well-developed area. There are inequalities in terms of the people, they have their income levels, higher in Lahore. So that's why most of these urban development projects, particularly for the last 20 to 30 years, those political parties who are in power, they have their base from Lahore, originated from Lahore. So naturally, Lahore, a lot of attention has been diverted towards, and a lot of resources over the years have been diverted towards Lahore. And this urban mass transit, that project is one of that aspect. But again, if you see the whole issue, I mean, it's a very delicate balance. I mean, at the one hand, of course, if these projects are sustainable in the long run and they have their economic viability, they have done that. It's a socially viable as well. It's environmental friendly as well. It's all electric, everything. But again, the sufferings of very few people, who are displaced, though they have been compensated at market rate of returns, or market rates, but still there are so many people who are not being very well compensated. But again, the issue, it comes back to the property rights, because they don't have that property rights or ownership statuses. And it's been since the partition, since the divide back in 1947, and they are just living in those areas without any proof and whatever, the legal documents and as such. And the thing is that courts over the years, they have granted them, they have allowed them to stay over there. And there's a rule, I guess, if you just stay at one place like 30 years, then nobody can evacuate you from that place. So I think it's a whole package. If you want to improve things at the one end, okay, fine, they are all the stakeholders, they have their vested interests. The government, of course, they want people to to give minimum compensations. The effect is they want to get the maximum compensations. The human
Ahmed,
rights and activists, yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we have a special request from one of our presenters who has to leave very soon.
Yeah, okay, fine. Okay.
But
yeah.
Thanks very much for that very important background and context that you've given us. Isaac has requested to come in now because he has to leave promptly to catch a train. So Weju, if you don't mind hanging on for a few moments. Also, Catherine, I saw you had your hand up, but Isaac, please, if you would like to take this opportunity to respond.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kathy and Yejo, for allowing me to come ahead of you. So I think Portia's and Professor Boone's, concerns are very important to me because they help me kind of probably motivate my research paper better. And I think it's probably more about the motivation. And so their concern is, why should we be surprised that chiefs are engaging in facilitating illegal mining? Isn't that what we should expect to see? And that if institutions constrain behavior, there wouldn't be any crime anywhere. I think the institutional scholars knew that if institution was, a panacea to any problem, if institutions were to be the panacea to problems, they knew that institution wouldn't be panacea to problem, but they contended that we should get the institutions right, if you get what I mean. And so the framework that I adapted was to try to kind of, suggest that, hey, institutions don't really getting institutions right, as Ghana has done with its minerals and mining laws, 1986, and currently 2006, having really kind of constrained behavior as the institutional prediction would expect us to see. So that is why probably I took that particular angle in motivating the people. But yes, I agree with Portia and Professor Boone that probably I could motivate it better. And I think Portia's concerned that she finds my research interesting in that it's not just about material interest, but also the loss of power on the side of chiefs that probably motivating them to engage in small-scale mining or facilitating is interesting. So I think probably in the future, I probably could look at how the existing literature kind of concentrates on the material interests of chiefs as a motivation or explanation for why chiefs engage in small-scale mining, and probably problematize that and say that, hey, it's not just about material interest, but it's more than that. And therefore, we need to look at the institutional change over time and how that's probably motivating chiefs to do that. And secondly, very quickly, Ranjaya's comment is very important, that who are the stakeholders involved in sustaining illegal mining? There are a lot of stakeholders involved in sustaining illegal mining. In Ghana, the two major political parties have their own people involved in doing small-scale mining and therefore sustaining it in that regard. Chiefs are just one of the power coalitions that kind of, contribute to sustaining small scale mining or illegal mining. This particular research is not about trying to understand why illegal mining is sustained or why illegal mining proliferates, but it's more about explaining why chiefs engage in facilitating illegal mining, because there's a lot of literature that has been written about why small scale mining proliferates from a technical kind of angle, but also political angle. And therefore, I don't think I want to reinvent the wheel. And that's why I'm trying to look at why chiefs engage in small scale mining rather than, the fact that they contribute to sustaining it. And if I'll be allowed the time, I think just a comment on Caroline's presentation. I think your presentation is very interesting. However, it does show how unequal power distribution across different customary areas, as is shown, can shape development outcomes in quite different ways. And therefore, I think it resonates with the political settlements literature, which is becoming a very important, literature in kind of providing an analytical lens in explaining various puzzles in different areas of development. And therefore, maybe if you could probably visit that particular literature, it could kind of help you in terms of conceptualizing your problem and also framing it in a much more robust way. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Isaac.
Thank you, Isaac, and have a good journey, and stay in touch because your research is fascinating.
Thank you so much. We'll stay in touch.
Weiju, sorry to have to leave you to last and with compressed time, but there was a question for you from Kathy, so there's a chance to respond and discuss a little bit.
Thanks for the question, Kathy. It's something I really I didn't really manifest in the 2x2 table, but there's one thing I do think you need to consider is most of the land reforms in African countries, especially the ones Zambia I'm studying, they hugely influence neoliberal in their core. So like the formalized with titling and transferring customer to state land is basically designed in their land law. It's like a kind of a natural thing to do in terms of the Land Act 1995 opens up precisely that opportunity. So I think the collusion you are talking about would be captured by my understanding of the state or formal institution provide the strong property institution to govern the private tenure, at the same time neglect or undermine the customary tenure. So with this broader institution setup, they will facilitate the transform or conversion of land from customary to state land. That's my understanding of, but I do think I need to twist the words in that table or my thing. So thanks for that.
Okay, thanks, Weiju. That was a clear response. Do we have any final comments or suggestions from anybody before we close?
No.
Thanks for the panel. Thanks for organizing.
Yeah, well, okay.
Nice
I think it's been a great panel. And I'd just like to say we've had 4 great presentations. We've also had some great questions. And I think the questions have all, on the whole, suggested how you can strengthen and strengthen your research even more in light of the analysis you've already done and the fascinating results that are coming out, questions that might suggest, well, perhaps you need to reformulate some aspect of your hypothesis or treat the theory in a slightly different way. It's not unusual that after you have analyze your empirical findings, you actually find that perhaps your research questions should have been slightly different. But I think some really important common issues are emerging here. I'm sorry we don't have more time to discuss, but I just recommend that anybody who wants to continue who's not already engaged, the LSE UCL seminar series and the DSA study group provides a context in which we can continue to engage. So hopefully we can do that. I would like to spend more time discussing your research. I'm sorry Isaac's not here to do that. Faria and Ahmad, it's great to have your participation from Lahore in a completely different context. So thank you all very much. And thank you, Rajanya, for being not only our technical support, but also an active participant in the debate. And we look forward to continuing to interact with you.